Welcome back to Son of Chelsea. Daniel Childs here. Hope you're doing really well on this Tuesday. Kind of a combo episode today. We're going to be doing, as promised, a reaction and breakdown of some of your comments over recent shows in reaction to some of the big issues around Chelsea, which I'm excited to do. But the first part, just going to react to some of the news that's come out today that I do think is relevant to cover on the show. Please like, subscribe. As explained, we do react to comments on here, your comments. So if you want to have them included in next week's show, please do drop them down below and I may add them in the future. So let's start off here. So we've been talking a lot about Dean Huijsen from Bournemouth. He's been linked to Chelsea. There were suggestions that Chelsea were actually front and centre in the race to sign him from Bournemouth. But Matt Law has reported for The Telegraph today that actually Real Madrid are now very confident of getting the deal done in front of Chelsea for 50 million from Bournemouth, who of course has caught the eye of many clubs this season and this summer is going to make that move potentially away entirely from the Premier League. Matt Law explains that there is no suggestion that Chelsea have given up their interest in the 20-year-old, but Madrid are confident of wrapping up a deal. Liverpool and Arsenal have also shown interest, but Chelsea do have other defensive targets such as Crystal Palace star Mark Guehi and Ajax's 19-year-old Jurel Hato as they look to add one new central defender to head coach Maresca's squad this summer. Space will be made through the anticipated sale of Axel Disasi, while Trevor Chalobah's long-term future remains a doubt despite the defender returning from a loan at Palace to perform well. Huijsen not being a Chelsea player I don't think is the end of the world. I do think Chelsea need to sign a new centre-back because I'm starting to look ahead to my end of season content of like a squad audit. And spoiler alert, there are a few centre-backs who I think we should be letting go, or I have to say I'm not too fussed if they're no longer here come the start of next season. So there is going to be space made. Now it's who occupies that space. One of the things that isn't mentioned here, or at least in this section, is of course you've got Mamadou Sarr, who Chelsea have bought from Strasbourg, who's going to be, we expect, joining the team. You've got Ansemino, who I think will go out on loan. He's a very young defender. You've got Josh Achimpom, who obviously can play in that area as well. So there is still a lot of uncertainty of what the back two is going to look like. Now, once again, we are left in a scenario, as we have done for 4 years in a row now, where Trevor Chalobah is going to end the season probably as Chelsea's strongest performing defender. And add to that, it's a Cobham back two of Trev and Levi, which I think says so much about the lack of good recruitment. It really does, especially once you lost Thiago Silva and, Tosin, who I think is, probably a decent influence off the pitch, but in terms of on the pitch, he hasn't, elevated Chelsea's defensive options, and that has been proven over the course of the season. That Chalobah was banished, sent out the club, never to return, and then he returns within 5 months, and of course, as expected, quickly becomes one of our strongest and most reliable defenders once again. So it's what you do from here. I like Mark Guehi, I have for a long period of time. I think in terms of Premier League experience and in terms of age and maturity, he's a further along the way than, say, Dean Huijsen. I think the thing with Huijsen, it's not that, again, I'll stress this, that it's just like, it does feel like to me a little bit of flavour of the month. And, I think if Chelsea, some of Chelsea's young centre-backs, say if Josh Achimpom was at Bournemouth for a season and then in a year's time, Josh Achimpom will probably be in a position where Chelsea would want to sign him. Why don't you just develop that player internally and instead focus on signing an older, more experienced, dominant central defender, an aerially dominant central defender? We speak about a lot with the attacking side. We lack aerial dominance. I think we really do physicality and height and strength. I know someone brought up Jonathan Tah in a comment recently, and I agree. Like, it's that kind of profile that maybe this squad is lacking. Do you think this is the end of the world? I really don't. I don't think this is like the end of good options for Chelsea this summer, but it's quite clear this is an area they have to figure out. But I'm slightly worried that we're going to be left in a position again where we're going to sell the wrong players and you're going to be left in a similar scenario boat in like 12 months time, where you're going to have to again go out in the market and spend because your recruitment simply has not been good enough. Another piece of news today that's slightly concerning is that both Christopher Nkunku, which, is not the end of the world because he hasn't been playing, but Reece James, both absent from training at Cobham today. Obviously, a couple of days now away from the Man United game on Friday night. Reece James not being there is obviously a concern. It's a bit of a red flag because he didn't start the game at the weekend. He came off the bench and he hasn't started a lot of Premier League games recently. You know, Chelsea have been very, very cautious. Maresca, to what some consider a fault. I think we may even have a comment about Reece James that we're going to react to in a little bit here. And I think that is, undeniable in terms of whether you want him to play at right back. Many people have argued, can his body even cope with the demands of being a right back in this game compared to being a more conservative central midfielder? But I think we just have to wait to see. I hope maybe there is some explanation for it. There was a little bit of a panic a week ago when Caicedo was missing training, and then we found out he was going to Ecuador to receive an award. So obviously Reece is not going to Ecuador to receive an award, but let's hope maybe it's just a little bit of rest because his body maybe they're being a little bit more cautious. That's my hope, because if he's not available and at this stage if you have any setback, I think you're basically missing the rest of the season, especially if you're someone like James who's been so good in terms of he returned in January and he hasn't had a setback since, which is great. I hope that is the case and this is not a sign of yet another setback, which would be absolutely devastating, I think, for Reece in terms of him returning to his best. So the only other thing I want to talk about is there's been a little bit of fear around Andrey Santos. A report came out from France that apparently Arsenal are interested in signing Andrey Santos this summer. And panic stations, are Chelsea actually going to do it? Are they going to sell Santos? Are they going to go back on their wide briefing that no, he's absolutely not for sale? Simon Phillips reported that Arsenal are certainly interested in Santos, but he's been told by the best Arsenal source that there is no chance of them landing the Chelsea midfielder this summer. Apparently Santos is not available for sale this summer and they are still planning for him to be in the squad next season. The only sticking point, Simon Phillips explains here for me, is that I have also heard from sources close to Santos, and although he is not asked to leave or anything close to that from now, he is keen to play regular football next season and beyond. There are real fears as to whether he will get that if he stays at Chelsea. Santos is obviously under a long contract until 2030. Apparently Chelsea want him in the squad for next season, and he will be going to the Club World Cup at least, so pretty soon actually. I know the kit is about to launch as well, so they want to have that in place and maybe some new signings by the time we go to America for the Club World Cup next month. Santos, specifically on this one, in terms of this specific report, I think that Chelsea would be absolutely insane to let Santos go to a rival that, in terms of points, Chelsea actually may not be that far away from come the end of the Premier League season. So that's just insanity. I think it would be insanity for Chelsea to sell Santos to anyone, because midfield has been a problem area this year in terms of depth. And I look at what Santos has become at Strasbourg under Liam Rossigna, a box-to-box, physically dominant, aggressive, attacking, inspirational kind of just intense midfielder, and the sort of profile that I think many people have craved seeing in this midfield. Just in terms of depth options, quality options, I think that is the first point. The second point is I can't sit here and honestly tell you to camera that, and to, if you're listening on the podcast, to my microphone, that there is no part of me that could see a world where Santos is sold. That's not me hinting at information I have that no one else has. This is just me analysing the reports, analysing the history of Chelsea. And, everyone is not for sale until a good offer comes in. And I kind of think that, the regular football thing is just obvious. Like, you've got to put that evidence in motion, really, that, Santos is not just there to be traded eventually. Actually, there is room for him to play a significant role for Chelsea, because quite clearly there is serious interest in him from a number of big clubs. We've even heard the likes of Bayern Munich linked. I suspect there will be other big European clubs out there. And if he knows, and he has just put out not just this season for Strasbourg, but also second half of last season, and the talent that was there and potential that was there in Brazil before that, he knows that there will be potential suitors. And I think that is something that Chelsea have to be wary of. Like, you can't, people want undying loyalty to players, but then don't seem to understand the other side of that, where if you don't give a pathway to players, if you don't make it clear that there is a serious plan for these players, they're going to move on. And I think people want, they want to have the cake and eat it. They want, undying loyalty from the players all the time. But then if those players turn around and think about what's best for their own career, suddenly they're the villains in the situation. I think a lot of people are kind of seeing Santos as a litmus test, really, because his development on loan at Strasbourg has been really positive. Now we want to see him integrated into the first team and become a regular first teamer. I do think there would be minutes for him, undeniably, given the number of games Chelsea play. The fact that the Club World Cup is going to put a lot of strain on every team that's playing in it. And then you go straight into a Premier League season, whether it's Champions League or Europa League, which I think it will be Champions League or Europa League most likely for Chelsea. Either of those competitions, you're going to need squad depth. You're going to need squad depth to play that. And there's no, look at the injury situation of Romeo Lavia, right? Like, there's no guarantee that he remains fit for the entirety of the season. There's no guarantee that everyone remains fit for the entirety of the season. And I think that Andrey Santos, because of his quality, because of what I think he could bring that kind of isn't there in the current Chelsea midfield, should back himself, and I think would get significant minutes. I'm really excited to watch a Chelsea midfield with Andrey Santos and the potential and the quality that's there. However, you've got to show that, right? And because of what happened, listen, like I keep on saying this, you people, and I'm not saying that people have bad information. I'm just saying, look at what happened last summer. If you're just ignoring what happened last summer, the mess that was last summer, and the fact that we did sell a very good central midfielder who was very good for us and very influential for us, before that summer, it was pretty clear that Chelsea wanted to sell him. So it's a different scenario in terms of briefing, but that's why there's a lack of trust. And until we see Santos be integrated properly, I think a lot of people will still be cautious about that. And I can't have a go at those people because evidence in history tells something different, in my personal opinion. So let's jump into your comments now. So Calvin H here says, "Hi Dan, I've been reading quite a few glowing reports about Emmanuel Omega of Strasbourg in Ligue 1. Have you seen him play? I've read glowing reports about his hold-up and link-up play along with his goal-scoring prowess. If you have seen him play, do you think he'll be a good addition to Chelsea along with Delap?" I've seen a bit of him, obviously, because keeping tabs on what Strasbourg have been doing. Shame they lost at the weekend, because it's going to go right down to the wire for them when it looked like a few weeks ago they were going to wrap up Champions League qualification. But he's had a really promising season. I looked at some of his numbers, and again, a bit like the strikers we spoke about yesterday, especially with someone like Omega, who you think would be a pretty good, easy deal to get done, to be honest, because you're basically talking to yourself to try and negotiate to get him over the line. But would it fall into the category again of another very raw player? Someone who does, I think, bring good attributes and has clearly done a lot of good work. But, if you're going to rate his track record this season, if you're going to rate Ekatike's track record for Frankfurt, then you kind of have to rate Nicholas Jackson's season last year for Chelsea. I know a lot of people don't want to in the current moment, but that's kind of what we're talking about at the moment. It's all about potential. It's all about what those players could become rather than what they currently are. And I think that's, again, my concern. I think in terms of depth, he could be a good option, just like Liam Delap, I think, would be a shrewd option because, again, number of games, quality of player, the squad depth and the profile in terms of the Premier League. I just think in terms of, again, is he going to be transformative unless you are uncovering a true gem? But even a player like Cole Palmer has been through some difficulty in the current Chelsea environment. So you will expect dips. And it's whether people are willing to tolerate those dips as you get with any young player. So I think that remains my concern, more so with younger strikers at the moment being linked to Chelsea. Sean says, "Why is everyone accepting James being benched? We can still have our midfield on the pitch if we sacrifice a winger and push Palmer to the right wing. James in his natural position and Enzo in the 10, problem solved. You don't bench your club captain in big games, period. If James pushes for a move, the same fan base will call him a snake, but it's obvious that he is not in Maresca's plans, and everyone is happy with this now because we are winning, but don't realise we could be losing the best right back in the world because Maresca is forcing him into a midfield position. I wouldn't blame James if he wanted to leave because it's clear to see he is not in the future plans." I feel with the situation with Reece James, I expressed this with Louis on the Chelsea Echo, and it's a weird one for me with James because, as we spoke about earlier with that report of him not being in training, right, you have to talk about his injury problems and you have to address and confront the reality of how much time he has missed and how difficult it has been for multiple Chelsea head coaches and ways and strategies to get him back to any sort of fitness. to deal with that. Like, you want to have this extraordinary talent on the pitch, but what if you push him too soon, too fast, and then you lose him for another 3 or 4 months and it's just a waste of time? So that in itself has clearly taken a toll on Reece James, I'm sure, psychologically. And the toll of that, and the club may be wanting to be... The strategy at the moment, sure, we know Maresca likes his inverted fullbacks. We know that from the start. We knew that before he even arrived at Chelsea, and he's done it consistently. However, I do think there maybe is also a consideration for this player's history, this individual player's unique injury history that has been taken into account, of not pushing him too much. I've had it put to me that, like, the reason, they want to see him get through a pre-season, they want to see him get through a substantial period of time without any setbacks, and then hopefully you can ramp him up back to a stage where he can play most weeks. But at the moment, he can't do that. So what do you want? Do you want a scenario where you're seeing some of Reece? I would like to see him more at right back. Absolutely. But you also just have to... It's not a fun conversation, and it's not a nice one, because you want to be in a position where we can talk about, we want the best right back in the world, in our opinion, in terms of like talent and potential, absolute potential being there, and what he could become, how ferocious he can be, how creative he can be, how instrumental we can be, and elevate our game. However, we can talk about all of that, and then you play him in that position and in a really intense game, and then he pulls up and you've lost him for like 2 months. That, I think, has probably come into the equation right here. So although I understand the discourse, because when you have Reece fit, the discourse will always be, why aren't you playing him? Why aren't you putting him in his natural position? And actually, can you put him in that position and him not actually having to do like a wing back Tuchel situation where he has to bomb down all the time? Because in this current system, actually, the way the fullbacks have been utilised as kind of central midfielders at times, like they're not being utilised as bombing wing backs, players who are going up and down that touchline all through the game. So there is maybe a compromise, but I think the injury situation comes into it, which makes it, unfortunately, an awkward conversation, and maybe why Maresca has been, and the current use of James has been as cautious as it has been, to the frustration of many fans. Monochromatic says here, the problem I see with the striker chase is that we can either get a big guy who might be a target on the gazillion crosses that we're doing, or we can get a finisher who is a bit smaller and less dominant in the air, but who will probably be a better chance converter and a big transitional threat, but we'll struggle with is getting someone who fits both styles of play. Osimhen looks like someone who can do both, but I have 2 worries that are magnified by how cooked will be if for whatever reason he doesn't deliver. And then in the comment, you go through his availability. The second worry I have with Osimhen is that he's being hyped up as a super strong striker who can bulldoze defenders. Remember Koulibaly, remember Lukaku, remember Pogba, players who are physically extremely dominant in Serie A, but who cannot replicate the dominance in the Prem worth a damn. And if I were not looking to just volley crosses, then we'll need to find the spaces and hit passes, same as we need currently. Osimhen will be a big step up when he's available, but we'll run into the same problems we currently have. The wingers become too predictable, isolated, and unable to get the job done. I don't think we can say that the striker situation is a simple fix, because we have done the big signing a number of times. We have signed the more obvious option in Chelsea, I'd say modern history, really, right? Like, we've done it a number of times. The striker graveyard has been gone over at Chelsea many, many, many times. And I will not have Hernan Crespo put in that list, but there have been many, many names, right? And Lukaku's the most recent one of, you felt like this just felt, it looked like the obvious option. It looked, physically, his history with the club, what Chelsea needed in that centre-forward role. He just led Inter Milan to a Serie A title. He'd scored a bundle of goals in the Premier League before. All of the boxes looked ticked. There weren't, that's the thing about transfers, right? Sometimes all the logic in the world and it still doesn't work out. Everyone in hindsight can go back and go, well, he couldn't play that way and do the whole Rubik's Cube thing that annoys me. Like, no, Lukaku, I still think logically should have worked based on everything we felt. But that's the madness of football. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. So, anyone trying to sell you that this guy is the 100% guarantee is probably lying to you, right? Like, and that's not to say that the player we get in won't work out. It's just, the issues you're bringing up. Like Osimhen, I think the biggest red flag about Victor Osimhen is obviously his injury history. And we live in an age of Chelsea where we have a lot of injury problems. We just spoke about Reece James extensively. Do you really want to add another player who might not be there for large periods of the season when they're put under strain and we need them to be there, because if they're not there, they leave a gaping hole. That in itself is a massive problem. However, I think Osimhen is in a age bracket of player I would more prefer Chelsea to sign, because I think if you're just looking for instant results, if you're looking for someone to come in and elevate the attack quickly from potential players, potential forwards who I think show good things but clearly are raw and a lot of pressure's being put on their shoulders, and you probably need someone there to take the bulk of that and develop and kind of, very much be a leading focal point for this group of attackers. That's why I'm looking at older players. But my instinct still tells me, all the history tells me that Chelsea are not going to do that. Chelsea are going to sign a younger striker. Now, Matt Law name dropped Benjamin Sesko today in that report about Dean Huijsen as well. Sesko is a young name. I was surprised yesterday when we did the show looking at his age and realizing how young he was, because it feels like he's been around for a while. So he has gained a lot of experience. It's not to say you buy 27 and over and that's as valuable in experience and guarantee of experience as someone who's like 21, who's actually played a lot of football, a lot of high-level football. Benjamin Sesko has played a lot of high-level, elite, pressurised football at this point. Of course, I think probably the pressure at Leipzig and someone like Chelsea is slightly different, but he has played high-level football, and it's not like this is a guy who's completely unknown. But, if he comes to Chelsea, it will be a different level of scrutiny in the Premier League than he's ever faced before, even if many people do highly rate him. That is the consideration you have to come to. So it's why maybe I sort of expected Chelsea put this tweet out that, is why he thinks that the Lap is quite a sensible signing. Because although it might not bring the superstar prowess and aura that everyone wants, there's not going to be the pressure on Liam Delap at £30 million to come in and be the 40-goal season striker, the world sensation. Actually, that might be better for him on his shoulders as kind of someone who actually has a lower bar, but it actually exceeds expectation. A bit like Jackson in his first season. The problem is, as Jackson has found in his second season, is then you have an expectation level, and then it's about developing and getting better and stronger. And that is obviously a challenge as well as a young player when you're still going through those growing pains. So yeah, that's a difficult one. So I think that Jackson's versatility potentially could be good, because I do still firmly believe, and I know a lot of people have just thrown him in the bin after Sunday, I think there is a lot about Jackson's game that is still worth persisting with. I think his movement off the ball, I think his speed in transition, I sometimes think his decision making in terms of linking up with players is actually pretty good and pretty underrated. But I think the pressure that's been put on his shoulders as the number one guy, the guy that has to lead us towards, in this case, Champions League football, but people are also looking ahead to, will this guy ever get us to challenging for a Premier League title? That takes its toll. And, I can imagine how maybe the burden would be lifted on Jackson, on Palmer, on everyone else, if you suddenly have that 20-goal a season striker that is so hard to get, will cost you a lot of money, but I think is worth the money. And it's then, guessing and kind of ascertaining this summer, who do you go for? Because the guy you go for, whether they're 27 or 22, other than Delap, is probably going to cost you a significant amount. Sesko is a long-term commitment. That is then your guy, probably, right? I know Chelsea have a track record of signings not working out and we have to sell them in 2 years, but I think that would be at least a signal that Sesko would be our main guy. And you're then committing to him, right? And you're hoping that he, as he grows older, develops into that player. But it sends a signal to everyone else. Hopefully a positive signal because he performs, but also a signal that this is our main guy, and then you're having to kind of gain minutes around that. So those are my thoughts, but it's a complex question because, as we know with Chelsea and we know with our striker history, it's not a simple spend 100 million, you get the 100 million striker. However, I do, just looking at the evidence in front of me, I do think Chelsea need to do something in attack. Like I don't think you can leave it another summer without getting anyone, at least a rotational option, someone who can come in and offer something different. That was a big problem this season. It was basically Jackson or nothing, and Jackson has got suspended. Mark Guiu is so raw, I think does need a loan, actually. That's another point I'm going to make later on, is that in our squad audit, I think Guiu does need a loan to get himself significant first team minutes. So then it's about building around that. So we will see. I think that Chelsea are adamant that they're actually going to do something in striker this summer. It's whether what they do pleases anyone, which obviously is a huge question. So that is it for today's show. Please like, subscribe, follow me across the socials at SonOfChelsea. From tomorrow, we'll start to build up to the Man United game. Got a guest from a Man United perspective on the show who I'm interested to talk to. And then, of course, the preview on Thursday. We'll react to any news between now and then. And I'll see you again very soon. All the best.